It's a timely question because yesterday the government published the draft online safety bill, which and one of the things that it sets out in that is that social media companies have a responsibility to act against hate speech, racist abuse on their platforms. They'll have to demonstrate to an independent regulator, which will be Ofcom, what policies they have in place to act against it. They could be externally audited by the regulator just to see whether they are doing enough. And as Chris said, when there's evidence out there, we know what form this abuse takes. We know you can see examples of councils doing it. What action do they take? And if the regulator felt they weren't acting effectively to stamp this out, then they could take action against that company. It's not just a question of the offence has been committed by the person that's posted the hateful comments. A company like Facebook could become liable for that content as well if they don't have effective policies to deal with it. I think this is not a freedom of speech debate. We should not live in a society where we say people in the public eye can be routinely abused on a massive scale because of their race, their ethnicity, their gender, whatever it is, and just think that in the tech age, that is just the price you pay for being in the public eye. We don't have to accept that. And so I think, and this problem is not a football problem or a rugby problem. This is a societal problem, but it's people who are in public positions, often sports people, that get the most abuse. And so I think that legislation can help with that. Just going back to the Football Offences Act, and as I said earlier on, the law commissioners are looking at that, and they, I hope they do propose a change in the law. I think it's required. But the issue is, and Chris pointed this out, is under the equalities legislation, there's nothing in law to stop people acting now anyway. And I think we should be going back to clubs and to the police and saying, here are examples of things that are happening in grounds today that actually wouldn't be allowed under the equalities legislation, and you should be intervening and doing something about it. And if you're letting it go, you're basically saying it's okay. And so I think there does need to be a big program of education there, because when we had people talking to us on the committee on this, people don't know.
I know you're on Twitter and Instagram, and you use social media quite widely, but you've actually engaged with some of these individuals that have actually abused you online. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, I sure are. You have good fun reading them as well, don't you, mate? Oh, I send them to you. Yeah, usually so once every year or so, if it's Football v Homophobia Month or whatnot, there's usually an article about me or something. I was very lucky actually recently. I'm doing my A license and Attitude magazine sponsored me, which was amazing. But when everything comes like that, I'll get loads and loads of messages. And usually not from England either, actually. They're usually from other countries, English-speaking countries or Russian-speaking countries. And it will fill up. And a lot of it is because, again, they don't really understand gay people or anything, because they've never met anyone that's gay, and all they've heard is from the media is bad things or whatnot. So I do my absolute best to try and challenge their thinking. I don't just say you're wrong, you're horrible, you're this or you're that. I actually just say, well, why do you think that? I'm gay. I've got a boyfriend or a fiance now of 7 years who I love very much. We're gonna have kids one day. Like, well, what's the issue, sort of thing? And I've actually, over time, actually had people like warm, I guess. And one of them actually asked me for a trial at the end. I was like, he's threatening to hang me about an hour ago, but okay, thanks for that, mate. I've done well there.
Just talking about, and again, it's Mental Health Awareness Week this week. The FSA this week are doing lots of activity around mental health and awareness. We've got a webinar tonight with loads of fans talking about how we can support each other. We're just on mental health awareness, Chris, because I think it's very, very poignant to discuss that this afternoon, because how has the LGBTQ plus community felt across some of the online hate that you see? If you talk about mental health, how has the community reacted, and how does it deal with some of the hate crime online, some of the hate crime in general that we see in football?
I mean, well, it's a big question. I think we know that sort of sadly that there are disproportionate mental health issues in our community. And I think if you're sort of living in fear, living in the closet, living against the backdrop of discrimination, that's not good for anybody's mental health. There's an LGBT plus education charity called Just Like Us who did some research during lockdown. So it's very relevant and recent research. And they found, LGBTQ plus young people still face unacceptable levels of homophobia, lesbophobia, biphobia, transphobia. 85% of them regularly hear homophobic remarks. LGBTQ plus young people are more than twice as likely to worry daily about their mental health. And Black LGBTQ plus young people are more likely to be worried for their mental health than their white counterparts. And this was exacerbated during lockdown. And we know sport can have a massively positive impact on your mental health. So that's why, you know, all of this is kind of tied up together, and it's why we do what we do in football, and it's why we're part of the family, and it's why it's important that fans were part of the social media boycott, which I'm sure we'll come on to. But while I've got sort of MPs, civil servants, people that can have an impact on these things, I'd like to talk about homophobic chanting, because that has a massive impact on mental health, something that Gareth's touched on.
Education is absolutely everything. It really is. And Chris spoke wonderfully earlier on about PE in schools. But I do think that that's a massive part of it. I mean this respectfully. And again, there's no wrong here, but I think the older someone is, perhaps the harder it is for them to change their views. They might do their best, but inherently it's still going to be in them. But actually, you learn right and wrong, and you learn to love and you learn to hate as a young person. I think actually, if we can educate our young people in schools and that, I think that the problems in the future go a long way in sport, in my opinion. So
Thank you, Luke.
Can I just jump in there for a second, Anwar? Sorry, because I think Luke's absolutely right. I think education is really critical. But if you look at the scale of the problem on social media, right, it's enormous. We did some work at Kick It Out, and you know, from July to September 2020, Facebook said they took action. So imagine like how much more of this there was on 6.5 million pieces of hate speech, right? That's the equivalent of 4,500 in every 90 minutes. So let's use 90 minutes as the length of a football match. That excludes any equivalent figures on Twitter. And, you know, so imagine what that's like. So you could probably say that there's probably one hate speech attack 1 second every day, 365 days a year. So that's like a cyber threat or email spam. So you need to apply sort of industrial scale tech to understand who's behind it and what their motivation is. And social media's got that data, because there's going to be different people that have different motivations. And so, you know, what Luke's managed to do there is understand the motivation of those people who were attacking him on that small scale. But in order to deal with it properly, we need to understand the sort of the taxonomy. You know, some are children, some are adults, some might be organized, others might not. Some are motivated by hate, some by mischief, whatever. So we need to understand that taxonomy and the root cause, because that's how we can prescribe proper granular solutions that are going to make a change. And I think the onus is on social media to use their tech, not just to sell us stuff, but to protect us.
I don't think that sport is where it should be, regardless what sport we talk about. Just because I came out in rugby like 10 years ago, and there's been no one since, but it's okay because I came out 10 years ago. So we got Nigel Owens who's a referee, or Tom Daly's a diver, so diving's okay, but he's the only person. You know, if you think globally at this point where we are when it comes to sport, I think if anyone on here, we all realize the power of sport. These people have platforms, they have column inches, they take up television. If we could name, 10 openly gay, male or female professional sports people competing at the top level right now off the top of our heads, then you know what, we'd be doing well. And out of the millions of people that globally participate in sport, then we got to realize we're talking about football today, but sport in general has got a long way to go. And I think, you know what I found is kind of the differences to sport. And I met Chris and the Lily Whites and so many other groups who are doing really, really well is what I was doing, because my club is Cardiff, okay? But that's my affiliation, that's my passion, right? But ultimately, where I think, well, really we have to ask ourselves, what is the need for having to have that representation in the ground? Is that representation is because we realize we have to be represented, or we have to show because there's a problem. And just on another point is when we talk about the intense pressure, and I've been to so many different grounds and experienced as a player or experience as a fan of rugby or a fan of football. I can tell you as an individual playing, is that the difference between being good and being great is a single second. It's a single thing you do. It's an instinctive moment. As you know, as a professional footballer yourself, Alan, right? And that to me comes from the ability to be 100% authentic. So when we don't have any openly gay players at the moment, or when we don't have an environment in the academies potentially where people can be their authentic self, then as a game, collectively as a game, you might be missing out on the next, like David Beckham.
What we looked at was really, I think, two very important things. One was, why is it that within professional football there are no out gay footballers, whereas in other sports, people have made that decision to come out. And what is it about the environment within football that has created that problem? Is that a problem within clubs? Within the environment in which footballers work as professionals that makes them feel unable to speak out? Does it come from the terraces? Is it a sense of abuse that could be directed at footballers? What is it that has created that barrier? The select committee looked at this a few years ago now and looked at both those aspects. And I think the one thing which I think would start is to say that there is a real sense that homophobia does exist within the sport, that there is prejudice against people who are gay, and that inhibits footballers wishing to talk openly about their sexuality. And there's also a problem on the terraces as well. And that whilst some progress has been made in terms of combating racist abuse within football, although actually I think since that report was published, I think we'd all be really concerned about the rise in hate speech and racist speech towards sports people on social media that seems to have got particularly worse in the last few years, maybe because people feel anonymous when doing it. But there was an attempt through legislation to make racist abuse within football grounds an offence. The Football Offences Act set out that was an offence. It was really clear to the police and the ground stewards they had the power to act. And I think we saw, through legislation, in part through changing social attitudes, in part from there being more black players playing football, there seemed to have been an improvement there. But what came out from what we looked at, and I know from what Gareth looked at in his documentary, was that it wasn't necessarily understood that homophobic abuse, whilst covered by the Equalities Act, is also a problem. It exists within the football environment. It exists within grounds. It is heard within grounds, but neither the police nor the ground authorities are really clear what power they have to act in those circumstances.